and welcome again to me, Helen, the Complaining Cow on the Complaining Cow Consumer Show. And today I have with me Ed Dodman, who is the Director of the Energy Ombudsman at Ombudsman Services. So, Ed, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And so just tell us a little bit about what it is that you do.
The Energy Ombudsman is a not-for-profit organisation, and our job, Helen, is to look at complaints between consumers and energy suppliers that remain unresolved and to try and figure out what a fair outcome would be for those consumers. So we do that for somewhere in the region of 100,000 consumers a year. As you can imagine, these are very important issues for people at the moment, and we try and reach a fair, independent and impartial outcome for people who come to us. That's the first part of what we do. The second really important part of what we do is to then try and use what we see from those complaints to support the industry, including suppliers, to help try and make things better. Ultimately, we want to see fewer complaints that come to us, so we try and use what we see to try and help suppliers, give a better level of service for their consumers.
What are you seeing are the most common complaints at the moment?
So we see a complete range of different types of complaints. So anything to do with the supply of gas or electricity into your home, essentially we can deal with. So that's typically things like, I've got a problem with my bill. Maybe I think I've been charged too much, or, I don't understand why my direct debit's changed. Something to do with your bill. That's probably our most common type of complaint, something to do with billing. But we look at things like customer service complaints, things to do with switching, metering. So absolutely anything to do with your energy supply is potentially an area that we can look into and help you with.
Have you seen sort of over the last 6 months, a year, a change in any of the complaints? I mean, I know there's been a huge uplift, but in the types of complaints that what people are complaining about?
Not really in the type, which is quite interesting. What we have seen, as you just alluded to, is an increase in the number of people coming to us, but that's really happened across all types of complaints. I think if you think about what's happened in the sector over the past few years, we've had obviously the COVID pandemic, and actually interestingly during that period we saw a drop in complaints because people quite understandably had other things that they were worried about. We've seen a lot of suppliers leave the market, so we have around 30 fewer suppliers than we did 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will have been some of those people who got moved to another supplier without choosing to. And obviously most recently, and probably most importantly for people, bills have doubled in what feels like a really short space of time. And I think, in that context, it's not surprising that people want to know that they're being treated fairly. And obviously it's an awareness thing, I think, as well, Helen, and that's, thank you to you and the other people who are constantly trying to explain to people what their rights are. I think more people than ever are aware of the different things they can do to make sure they are being treated fairly now. So we've seen an increase in complaints across the board. It's not really happened in any particular category. I think people are just more willing than ever to make sure that they are being treated fairly, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, we're always trying to push people to go to an ombudsman scheme, but I think there's misconceptions about ombudsman, and as you know, I've done a lot of work in this area, and it goes right across. Even sort of people in the consumer sort of sector don't necessarily understand just exactly how alternative dispute resolution, of most of which are ombudsman, or how it works. They always think they're going to see in favour of the business because the businesses are paying them, but then it's a case of actually, if you look at the annual reports, that's not the case at the moment. What's the percentage of cases that you are upholding?
Around 3/4 of the people who come to us, Helen, leave our process with something that they didn't have. Now, that's not necessarily saying that we upheld everything in the complaint, because often complaints are, there's lots of different components to it. But around 3/4 of the people who come to us leave with something more than what they had. So I think that, that sort of attests to the fact that it is something that's worth doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to be absolutely clear, we're not a consumer advocate. We're not a consumer champion per se. We exist to try and get the right outcome for people who might not have another option to do that. If we didn't exist, the way people would have to get a resolution if their supply is not provided, it would be to have to go through the courts. That is a difficult process for people. I work in the energy sector, and I would be quite daunted by that process. So although we're not a consumer advocate per se, we do exist to make it as easy as possible for people to get that right outcome. And as you've said, we're really trying to break down any impression that people have of an ombudsman as a kind of legalistic person that sits there behind a desk making a judgment on you. It's absolutely not that. We're trying to be as accessible as possible. And if you do choose to use our service, we would take you through the process step by step and explain what you need to tell us and when and what you can expect from us.
Yeah, I think, most sort of ombudsmen are, have always had that approach. You pick up the phone and talk to us and we'll help you through those forms, and whether it's online or paper. But I still think there's so many misconceptions. Like I said, that people that just assume that you're going to see in favour of businesses when the facts do not sort of show that at all. And actually, businesses don't want cases going to the ombudsman because it costs them to do so. So
exactly. And I think the other thing, Helen, is another reason people might not want to come to us is because they may have been through a very arduous process with their supplier, and it then takes another effort to go, actually, no, I'm not happy and I do want to take this forward. We do speak to consumers who are absolutely exasperated from the process that they've been through. And so that's why it's even more important than ever that we try and be as accessible as we can and make things as easy as possible.
Are you sort of seeing people that are struggling more with the process? Or is that kind of a steady stream of you're having to help the same kind of percentage with their applications, or not the applications, but the process?
I think we're working really hard, to extend our reach to people. So I think, there are, we want to make sure that our process is as accessible to as many people as possible, and that anyone feels comfortable coming to us, whether you want to do that over the phone, online. We still have people who choose to do that by letter, and that's absolutely fine. We are continually trying to make improvements to our process to make it easier for people at each stage of the process. So, whether you come to us online or over the phone now, the first thing that we'll do is try and speak to you in person to understand what's going on, to explain what information might be helpful to support your case, and also to be able to set expectations about what you can expect from the rest of our process. So we're very aware that we want to make it as easy as possible for as many people as possible, especially those people who historically might have been less likely to want to come to us or have been prepared to take that next step.
Yeah, I mean, are you sort of seeing people trying to complain about the price of their bills and hoping that you can do something about it because of the huge hike, which obviously you can't actually do anything about, but you may be able to in the process of getting payment plans sorted? What are you seeing around that area?
So I think it's not surprising, given the price of energy has doubled in 18 months, 2 years, that some people are coming to us and looking to complain about that. You're absolutely right that it's not our job to regulate the price of energy. And unfortunately, if people do come to us and the complaint is simply about the, let's say, the level of the price cap that is set by government or Ofgem, then unfortunately we have to say, look, that's not within our remit to change. But you're quite right. There are a lot of obligations on suppliers to support consumers in other ways. For example, payment plans, as you indicated, making their consumers aware of what other support might be available. And that would absolutely be within our remit. So if a consumer felt like their supplier wasn't living up to those expectations, then we would absolutely look at that. So unfortunately, sometimes we have to say, look, that's not within our remit. But often it's a bit more complicated than that. And actually, probably less often than you'd think, it's actually about the price of the energy. Sometimes there's more that you need to uncover when you look at the complaint, and sometimes it's the way that the supplier has supported the consumer around that we might need to look at.
You might not be able to answer this, but are you seeing some companies doing a lot worse than others in supporting customers?
I think that there have always been differences in how effective suppliers are across different complaint categories, and we work with those individual suppliers to point that out to them and help them get better. I wouldn't say there are particular suppliers that have been particularly poor at things like making sure that people have access to the support that they deserve. Things like the government support that's been in place over the past few months. you'll be aware that there are some, investigations that Ofgem is conducting at the moment about how well suppliers have done in some of these areas, and we're feeding our insight and data into those investigations because ultimately I think one thing we're very aware of as the Ombudsman is that we're just a part of the picture, and we naturally, given our position, do see some of the worst examples of consumer experiences, and I think it's important that we put that insight into the context of everything else that goes on, because ultimately most problems that consumers have most of the time are able to be resolved by their supplier. What we see are the examples that come through that haven't been. So I think it's just important that when we see examples of poor supplier behaviour, we have the context around it to explain actually what does that mean in the context of everything else that we're seeing.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about the work that you actually do with suppliers.
We operate at a kind of range of levels, Helen. The first thing we do is obviously try and make sure that the consumers who come to us, and indeed the suppliers who are part of that as well, get the right and fair outcome. That's the first of our jobs. The second is working with individual suppliers to make sure that we use our insight. So, for example, if we were to see a particular spike in a type of complaint from one supplier, we would talk to that supplier and try and understand, why are those consumers more likely to come to us than other suppliers? What's going on in your process that is making those consumers feel like they're not getting a fair outcome? That's the second thing. And we do that with a range of suppliers across a range of issues. And then the third thing that we do is where we do detect that there is something more systemic, or indeed someone like Ofgem has asked for our insight, we might look at the market overall and try and understand if there are things that are going on across suppliers. And that might be to support Ofgem with an investigation. It might be to help design new policy or regulation around the market based on what we're seeing. So we try and use our insight at a number of levels. One, help those consumers who come to us. Two, help individual suppliers where we're seeing issues, or indeed seeing good things, because we should celebrate that as well. And three, supporting the industry as a whole where there are systemic things that we might be seeing.
How do you find how receptive companies are to that?
I think to your point earlier, Helen, no supplier wants a consumer to have to come to us. As you said, there's a cost to us, but I think there's a bigger thing, which is around consumer trust. Most suppliers are very receptive to what we're telling them. And I think they understand that as a not-for-profit organisation, we're not in it for any other purpose. We ultimately want to reduce the number of complaints that come to us. So we share a common goal with suppliers. Now, that doesn't mean we take sides, because we're completely independent and impartial. But if we've got good insight that suppliers can use, then generally speaking, they're very receptive to it. Obviously, suppliers have a lot of challenges at the moment, and sometimes suppliers know what the problem is before we then tell them, because obviously they can see how many of their consumers are feeling the need to come to us as well. But yeah, we're constantly looking to improve the way we support suppliers and industry, and making advice as specific and as helpful as we can for everybody.
So do you see sort of much feedback from sort of consumers about when a decision has been made that, quite often people say, well, I don't like the Ombudsman because the Ombudsman hasn't seen in their favour. Is that, do you get sort of feedback about that, and
Yeah.
Can they appeal?
So we do get feedback, and we ask for feedback from consumers for whose complaints we've upheld or not. We want all consumers to leave our service feeling like they've been listened to and feeling like we've reached a fair outcome. And that it may be that we've upheld the complaint, and it may be not, but we'd still want every single consumer to feel like they've had a fair hearing. So we do ask for feedback. We ask consumers that throughout the process, so we can tell where we need to improve. In the way we explain to consumers, we are trying to introduce a more personal approach whereby we actually speak to consumers more often, Helen, because again, to try and break down the legalistic view of an ombudsman, it'd be quite understanding if a decision document landed in your inbox and it was pages and pages of details about this complaint, and you look through it and don't understand it. It might be no wonder that you therefore don't think you've had a fair hearing. Whereas if we speak to you to explain how we've reached that conclusion and why we think the supplier has acted fairly or otherwise, then we find that it leaves consumers with a much better feeling that they've been listened to. So we're trying to make that a much more personal approach from our perspective.
Do people appeal after something's gone against them?
So we don't operate an appeal process per se. There are a small number of circumstances where we might look again at a decision. So a good example of that, Helen, is where there was information that would have changed the decision that we've seen that wasn't available at the time, but has come to light since. And if that's an important and material thing, we might then look again at it and go, actually, we do need to consider that now, and that may or may not change a decision. We don't just review decisions for the sake of it, because one of the reasons is whenever we do that, that means somebody else waiting for our service has to wait a little bit longer. So there are some circumstances, and again, if you use our process, we will be absolutely clear with you what those circumstances might be.
What sort of patterns do you think you're seeing in customer service? Is it that companies are not investing in the training, that they're not investing in enough staff? What sort of things do you think are causing the rise in right across sectors?
Well, I think there's some very specific things about the energy sector, obviously, and I've talked about some of those things. You can't, bills have doubled in this sector. And I think it's at least part of the explanation why people's energy services are becoming a lot more important to them, because if you had a disagreement, say, over your bill in the past, maybe it was for £20, you might have decided that wasn't worth your effort to complain about. Rightly or wrongly, that's what you might have decided. That might mean a lot more to you now. People are feeling the pressure across not just energy, but we know prices across other goods and services are going up as well. And I think that does partly explain it. What we do see a lot of is when people come to us is that there's not something systemic going on with the supplier. There's not a problem necessarily with the policy or what's going on with suppliers, but it's that consumer that's been let down. And it's a problem of how that company's executed their policy, the individual experience that they've given that consumer. So sometimes I think it's about consistency, Helen, and you'll have a lot of insight on this as well from other sectors, but sometimes it's about understanding and supporting suppliers about how do you make sure you give that consistent experience that you are looking to provide to consumers across the board, and how do you minimize the number of people for whom they get a very different experience. So I think sometimes it's about consistency in the way you deliver what you are trying to do for consumers. That's very difficult sometimes, given the circumstances of the market. We're very aware that suppliers are seeing more contact than ever from consumers, and that fact alone would make us think that we'd see more consumers coming to our service. I think it's just about understanding what's that really valuable insight you can get that can help that supplier the most. And obviously what that is varies a lot depending on which supplier and what complaint type we're looking at.
What would you like to see happen in the energy sector?
Oh, that's quite a big question, Helen. I think there's there's going to be a lot of thinking, I think, and reflecting on the past few years about what needs to happen in the energy sector going forwards. Government and Ofgem clearly have some big decisions about what happens with things like the price cap and ongoing support for consumers. And I think it wouldn't be our position really to comment on that sort of thing. I think what we want to see, our mission as a business is to help build trust between suppliers and consumers. And I think, speaking generally, what I would like to see is a culture in the energy sector whereby suppliers, consumers, and organisations like ourselves are working together really closely to help build that trust. It is a sector that is going to change incredibly over the next few years when we look at the type of goods and services that people might receive from their energy supplier that they don't today. Today, most people just get their gas and electricity. It might only be one of those things if you're only on electricity. In the future, we might have things like, electric vehicles, people generating their own electricity from their properties, that sort of thing. And I think if that kind of system is going to work, then you really need the trust in place between suppliers and consumers, because why would you choose to take one of these products from somebody who you didn't trust? So I'm speaking quite generally, Helen, but I think the thing I would like to do is to start to see that trust being built or rebuilt as needed between suppliers and their consumers. And, we're a part of that. And, that's part of our mission, and we'll do whatever we can and use whatever insight we've got to help that happen.
I think it's going to be very hard, isn't it? Because people are just seeing energy companies making massive profits and then not handing it down to consumers. And I know there's complications around that, but that's basically what the majority of people see. So I think it's very much an uphill struggle to get trust going again.
I think that's right. I think that, it is very challenging, and it's it was challenging before this happened, Helen. And I think even more challenging in the context where people's bills have gone up quite so much as what they have. Now, obviously, as we know, a large part of that is outside of the control of the energy suppliers. But that's not necessarily how the consumer sees it, as you've just said. So I think it's, it is about figuring out how we rebuild that trust and supporting suppliers to help build the relationships in the context of what we're working with as best we can.
Do you see any sort of companies doing customer service well?
We see good examples across all suppliers, Helen, and I think it's really important to say that, given where we are in the process. It's tempting sometimes to just talk about the worst things that we see, but we do see examples from all suppliers where they've done absolutely the right thing for consumers. And maybe there was a breakdown in communication, but actually they followed the rules and they've done things properly. We see good examples across all types of complaint types. We try and share that with the sector more broadly. Sometimes we do that anonymously, obviously, but whether it's good or bad, where we see things that could help the industry, be it good or bad, we try and pull those examples and share with the others. You know, there are things you can learn as a supplier about your own complaints. Equally, there are things that you can learn about what other suppliers have done well or poorly. So we do have lots of examples of these things where we've seen good and bad, and we try and use that best we can with all suppliers.
Do you bring suppliers together at all to sort of learn from each other?
Yeah, we do. So every few months we invite suppliers to come and see us at the Energy Ombudsman. We talk about things that we're seeing across the industry, you know, insight that we've pulled that we think could be helpful for suppliers generally. And we have, you know, individual conversations with suppliers where we need to as well. So there's lots of channels that we can use, and we do bring suppliers together to try and share that insight where we think it would be useful for the sector as a whole as well. Yeah.
Where, I don't know if you'd be able to answer this, but would you be able to give an example of any work that you've done with the supplier where it really instigated a change in their behaviour?
Again, without going into specifics, I'll give you an example around billing. Billing, as I said, is one of our the biggest types of complaints for us, and there are rules in place to make sure that suppliers treat customers fairly. One of those rules is what we call back billing, which I'm sure you are familiar with, Helen. Just to explain to your listeners, back billing is a rule that prevents suppliers collecting charges from you that are beyond a certain age. So a supplier, if it's incorrectly charged you for the past 5 years, can't go back 5 years and tell you that you owe them, you know, tens of thousands of pounds. There are rules in place to make sure that suppliers can go back a reasonable amount. Now, over the past couple of years, we've seen, you know, some suppliers implementing these rules really well, others less clearly. And what we have done with the industry is pull out those best practice examples to try and increase consistency about how these rules are implemented. And we've seen some real success where suppliers have, you know, changed the way that they operate their processes internally, and ultimately, hopefully, will result in fewer consumers having to come to us. So I'm sorry, that's a bit of a geeky example, but that's the kind of thing we do, you know, where we can add clarity on what we think is best practice in the way a supplier should be treating their consumers. We'll try and use that across the board and demonstrate how we think it should be done, and also how we treat those cases when they came to us, because I think it's really important that suppliers understand how we will look at a case, because if they understand that properly, then they can anticipate what we might say, and that might then influence you know, how they might want to treat a consumer before they ever come to us.
Have there only been times where the companies come to you and said, help us with this?
Yeah, we do get examples of that. So, you know, sometimes a supplier will know that they are getting a particular spike in complaints in a certain category. They might come to us to ask us, you know, how we might look at that type of complaint if it came to us. And they might also ask, you know, for clarification on how we think they should be dealing with it. That billing example I gave, Helen, is a good kind of example of how that might happen. So given where we are in the process, suppliers often see these problems before we do. And I think it's really good to see actually where suppliers identify that proactively and try and anticipate how we might view those complaints to then try and resolve as many as they can before they get to us, because ultimately it's a much better experience for everyone if that consumer can be serviced properly before they ever need to come to us. So yeah, we do see it, and it's something we absolutely encourage suppliers to do.
That's really interesting. I think probably the best thing to end on would be, what would be your top tips to anyone that has got a complaint with their energy supplier?
So this won't surprise you, Helen. The first thing that they absolutely need to do is, if you're not happy with the service that you've been given to by your supplier, you need to complain. It's
Yep.
it's so important. I'm telling you what you already know, but it's so
But
important.
no, I can't say it enough to consumers. So please do.
It's important for a couple of reasons. One is, most of the time when you do that, the supplier should be able to resolve the issue for you. And it's important that you make sure the supplier understands why you're not happy with what's happened to you. The second is, it's a really important part of our process, because before you can come to the Ombudsman, your supplier needs to have had an opportunity to resolve your complaint for you. Now, if you raise a complaint, there are two places where you can then come to us if you're not happy. The first is if you receive what we call a deadlock letter, which is essentially when the supplier says, look, we've done all we can for you. We're going to have to agree to disagree. If you want to take it further, go to the Ombudsman. At that point, you can come to us. Secondly, if you're not happy with what they're doing, after 8 weeks, since you've raised the complaint, you can come to us as well. And that's regardless of where you are in the process. So that's why it's really important to make that complaint, because it then determines when you can come to use our service. The second thing is, and again, I know this is something that you advocate, Helen, you suggest people keep a journal of what's happened. Mm-hmm. I'd really echo that as well. It's really helpful if you can keep a record of anything that you think might be helpful for your complaint. And that might be a record of when you've spoken to your supplier. It might be, a bill. Anything that you then could think help summarize your case to us when you come to us will help us understand it, and B, potentially help speed up the process, because we'll have all of that information that we need from you there and then. So those would be my two things. Make sure you complain to your supplier if you're not happy, and B, do what you can to make the process easy for you later on by keeping a record of what goes on and all the important bits of information that you think you might need.
What do you think are the biggest mistakes that people make when they take a case to the Ombudsman? Is it that they don't have the evidence and that they've just been phoning and they don't have the evidence? Or is it more to it than that?
I think this varies. I wouldn't call them mistakes, Helen, because I think it's quite understandable if you're going through a complaint with your supplier not to think that you'd have to record when you've had a phone conversation. And, you quite rightly expect the supplier to fix it for you. So why would you go in with a negative attitude thinking that you've got to record everything? So although I wouldn't call it a mistake, I do just think it's helpful if you can take the time to organise what's gone on and to record what you've been through, because it will help the process. Now, if you haven't been able to do that, I wouldn't say don't come to us. There are ways we can find out, and we will talk to the supplier and understand what's happened. So it shouldn't put people off, but I think it's just really good practice to try and keep as much information and as much of a record as you can, because it will also help you talk to your supplier. If you're going through the complaint process with your supplier and you've got a really good record of what action you've taken so far, that should help them get to a resolution with you as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. Mistake was probably the wrong word. I think it was about what are the kind of things that people do that sort of lets the process down, really. It's the other side of, these are all the things that you can do to help the process. But I think that's, that also goes back to earlier when I was talking about when can people appeal when they've got, more information.
Yes.
Coming to the fore. So I think, are you still seeing the cases rising, or is it plateauing at all?
Cases have gone up, as I said earlier, over the past few years. We're seeing that sort of level continue. So it's stabilising a little bit, but it's still higher than it has been over the past few years. So obviously our focus is on making sure we get consumers and suppliers resolutions as quickly as we can. Obviously, we'll see what happens with prices and the market going forwards, and I'm certainly not going to make any predictions around that. But we'll continue to offer our free, independent, impartial service to whoever decides to come to us. And I'd encourage people, if they haven't thought about doing that, and based on what they've heard today, if they think we could help them, to really seriously think about coming to us.
Absolutely. Well, that I've done a lot of work in this area, and I'm forever saying to people, it's the free alternative to court. You really must try. I'd like to see the Ombudsman in far more areas than just energy, because it does work. And I think it's breaking down the myths and misconceptions about Ombudsman that is the biggest struggle, really, and making sure people realise that it is easier than you think, and they're not always going to see in favour of the companies, and that's not the case. Getting that across, that sort of piece of
communication is quite tough. Yeah, it is. And then, just thank you for the opportunity to come on your show, Helen, and for all the work you've done to promote it. It's the best way of explaining to people what we're about and how we can help. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Well, you're very welcome. And thank you very much for joining me, Ed. Cheers. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And well, I hope you found that useful and interesting, and thank you for listening. And if you have a topic you'd like me to discuss on the show, you can email me at helen@eastlondonradio.org.uk, and you can find me on my website, thecomplainingcow.co.uk, for lots of information on consumer issues, including consumer rights, money saving matters, and you can also see all the other episodes of the Complaining Cow Consumer Show on East London Radio. You can find me on Twitter @Complaining Cow and The Complaining Cow on Instagram and Facebook. And you can get a 15% discount off my books with ELR Cow on the website. That's How to Complain, the Essential Consumer Guide to Getting Refunds, Redress and Results, and 101 Habits of an Effective Complainer. Thank you very much, and see you.